Imagine running for president of the United States without holding a single rally, giving an interview, or even leaving your room. In 1920, the labor leader and multi-time Socialist Party candidate Eugene V. Debs managed to do exactly that, running his final campaign for the White House from inside a federal prison cell. To understand how he got there, we have to look back to 1917. The United States has just entered the First World War, and President Woodrow Wilson is demanding total national unity. But Wilson faced a problem. Thousands of pacifists, socialists, and anarchists across the country were vocally opposing the war and the draft. The government responded with the Espionage Act of 1917. While the name suggests a law meant for foreign spies, the actual text included incredibly broad restrictions on public speech. This vague language established the conditions for a conflict over civil liberties, as the government gained the power to treat political dissent as a federal offense. The act reached beyond traditional espionage. It specifically criminalized any speech intended to interfere with military operations or recruitment efforts. The penalties were harsh. A conviction could result in massive fines and up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. It also granted the Postmaster General the authority to block magazines and newspapers from the mail if he decided their content violated the law, a practice known as prior restraint. Under Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, the Justice Department used these powers to silence a wide range of critics. They jailed a filmmaker for a movie that depicted British soldiers as cruel and imprisoned religious leaders for writing anti-war books. The crackdown even reached the famous anarchist Emma Goldman. She was arrested for her activism and eventually deported to the Soviet Union on a ship the press called the Soviet Ark. A law presented as a shield against foreign intelligence had become a tool to suppress domestic political opposition. This brings us back to Eugene Debs. In 1918, he stood before a crowd and gave a defiant anti-war speech. Because his rhetoric was seen as an attempt to obstruct the draft, he was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Even so, in 1920, Debs launched his fifth presidential campaign from behind the bars of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Since he was unable to tour or debate, he had to rely entirely on written statements released through the prison's administration. The campaign stood as a paradox. The United States was fighting a war for democracy abroad, while its own political opposition was locked in a cage at home. This raises a critical question. How is it legal to keep a presidential candidate in prison just for giving a speech? The answer arrived in the case Schenck v. United States. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the Espionage Act was constitutional and did not violate the First Amendment. The court established a new standard. The government can restrict speech if it creates a clear and present danger. To explain, Justice Holmes used a famous comparison, arguing that free speech wouldn't protect a person who falsely shouts fire in a crowded theater. This ruling meant that during wartime, the highest court in the land believed individual liberty could be set aside for the sake of state security. As the war ended and the paranoia of the Red Scare began to lift, the political environment finally changed. In December 1921, after Debs had served nearly 5 years of his 10-year sentence, he was finally granted his freedom. It was President Warren G. Harding who commuted his sentence, releasing Debs and several other political prisoners. While some of the later amendments to the law were repealed, the core of the 1917 Espionage Act was never removed. Today, that same century-old law remains the primary tool used by the government to prosecute whistleblowers and national security leakers. Eugene Debs never won the White House, but his campaign from a cell remains a warning about how a law designed to catch spies can be redirected to silence citizens.